178. Cardinals were already seated inside Paul VI Hall when the atmosphere began to change. It was June 26, 2026, and the Vatican had arranged the room with the precision of an institution that understood power. 20 round tables stood across the vast hall. Red skull caps, black cassocks, sealed folders, translation devices, and glasses of water waited beneath the lights. On paper, this was an extraordinary consistory about unity, synodality, and the future mission of the Catholic Church. In reality, something far more dangerous had entered the room before the Pope ever spoke. Pope Leo XIV stood at the front without raising his voice, without touching the papers placed before him, without giving the cardinals the comfort of a normal opening address. He looked across the hall slowly, table by table, face by face, as if he were no longer seeing a college of advisors, but a map of hidden decisions. Some cardinals held his gaze, others looked it down too quickly. The silence lengthened until it stopped feeling ceremonial and started feeling procedural. Then Leo leaned toward the microphone. "I know everything." The 3 words did not explode. They did not need to. They passed through the room with the force of a locked archive being opened by the one man no one believed would dare open it. A cardinal reached for his water and missed the glass by less than an inch. Another folded his arms tightly against his chest. 2 men at the same table exchanged a look so brief that anyone outside the room might have missed it. But inside that hall, it registered like evidence. No one asked what he meant because the men who needed to understand already understood. For several seconds, Pope Leo said nothing more. He let the words remain suspended over the 20 tables, over the private letters, the discreet transfers, the confidential meetings, the leaks, the blocked reforms, and the alliances that had been built in silence across 3 continents. This was not a sermon. It was not a symbolic reprimand. It was a controlled institutional strike delivered in public with the calm of a man who had already read the files. By the time the first cardinal lowered his eyes, the old rules inside the Vatican had already begun to collapse. The men in that room had been sworn to confidentiality. No recordings, no statements, no leaks. But secrets do not survive when 178 men carry the same fear. Back to churches on 6 continents. What happened inside Paul VI Hall was supposed to remain buried behind Vatican walls. Instead, it became the moment Pope Leo XIV showed the College of Cardinals that the shepherd had counted the flock, and he knew exactly which sheep had been moving in the dark. The first sign that the consistory would not be ordinary came the night before inside the Apostolic Palace. On June 25th, Pope Leo XIV canceled his entire evening schedule without explanation. There would be no dinner with advisors, no diplomatic phone calls, no late briefing from the Secretariat of State. The appointments disappeared from the calendar, and the silence around the decision was sharper than the decision itself. In his private study, the Pope sat alone while Rome held its heat against the closed windows. His personal secretary, a young Augustinian priest who had served beside him since his missionary years in Peru, found him under low light with one manila folder open on the desk. It was thick, worn at the edges, and filled with documents printed on plain paper without Vatican letterhead, without official seals, without the comfort of anything that looked institutional. Leo did not look up when the secretary entered. He only turned another page. For nearly 2 hours, the Pope read in complete stillness. Page after page moved beneath his hands, and nothing in his face betrayed surprise, anger, or fear. But his hands changed. Each time he turned a sheet, his fingers tightened slightly at the corners, as if every page was confirming something he had not wanted to be true. The room remained closed, the folder remained open, and outside the door, the normal machinery of the Vatican seemed to wait for a signal that never came. When Leo finally reached the last page, he closed the folder and left both palms flat against the desk. He stayed that way for several seconds, leaning over the documents in silence, breathing slowly through his nose. Then he said one word, low enough that it sounded less like emotion than judgment. Enough. His secretary asked whether he needed anything. Leo shook his head, but he did not dismiss him immediately. He looked once toward the folder, then toward the closed windows as if the night beyond them had already become part of the next morning. What he said next would remain with the young priest long after the consistory ended. Tomorrow, they will understand that the shepherd knows his flock. All of it. The folder had not come through the normal channels. It arrived 48 hours before the consistory, carried by a Vatican official whose name never appeared on a public schedule, and whose visit left no trace in the appointment logs. No formal audience was recorded. No memorandum marked its delivery. Inside a system built on documentation, that absence was itself a warning. The material came from deep inside the Secretariat of State, from someone who had spent more than 6 months collecting what others had tried to erase. There were photocopied bank statements, screenshots of encrypted messages, internal memos marked confidential, and private letters exchanged between senior cardinals in careful language that became less careful the longer the paper trail continued. Some documents had been marked for destruction. Others had been circulated through side offices, where accountability was designed to become fog. At first glance, the folder looked like evidence of resistance. But as Leo moved through the pages, a larger architecture emerged. The same names appeared in different countries. The same organizations received attention after the same reforms were announced. The same phrases appeared in letters, interviews, and internal objections, as if separate voices had been reading from one hidden script. This was not spontaneous concern from aging churchmen afraid of change. It was coordinated, funded, and protected across 3 continents. The opposition was not simply theological, and it was not merely personal resentment against the first American pope. It had money behind it, media channels prepared to amplify it, and ecclesiastical allies positioned to slow the reforms before they reached the ground. What Leo saw in that folder was not disagreement inside the church. It was sabotage dressed in the language of prudence. That was what made the discovery so dangerous. Every pope expects resistance. Every reforming pontiff knows that smiles in Rome can hide knives, and that the most careful men often do the most damage, without raising their voices. But this was different. This had been operating beneath Leo's own roof since the first months of his papacy. And by the time he closed the folder, the question was no longer whether the network existed. The question was how many men in Paul VI Hall already knew they were inside it. Pope Leo XIV had understood from the first day of his pontificate that he had been chosen because he did not fit the old Vatican pattern. He was the first American pope in history, the first Augustinian to lead the church in centuries, and a man whose formation had not been limited to Rome's ceremonial corridors. He was born in Chicago, raised in Dalton, educated at Villanova, trained in canon law in Rome, and shaped for decades by missionary work among poor communities in Peru. He knew marble, he knew mud. That made him difficult to classify and even harder to control. He had governed the Augustinian order worldwide for 12 years, carrying files through Roman offices in one season and walking the roads of Chulucanas in another. He spoke 5 languages. But what mattered more was that he understood 5 kinds of silence: the silence of poverty, the silence of bureaucracy, the silence of obedience, the silence of fear, and the silence men use when they believe power will protect them. By the time he entered the conclave, he was not an outsider. He was something more dangerous to the old system, a man who had lived inside it without being owned by it. The Cardinals had elected Robert Francis Prevost on May 8, 2025, in the shadow of Pope Francis's death on April 21st. Francis had left the church grieving, divided, and unfinished, with a reform vision that many praised in public and resisted in private. His pontificate had pushed the Catholic Church toward accountability, missionary urgency, synodality, and a more open style of governance. By choosing Leo, the Cardinals signaled that they wanted that direction to continue. But wanting reform in a conclave is not the same as accepting reform when it reaches the accounts, the offices, the committees, and the men who have spent years learning how to delay decisions without ever saying no. Some cardinals believed Leo would be calmer than Francis, more juridical, more predictable, easier to absorb into the institution. They misunderstood him. They mistook restraint for softness, and they mistook patience for ignorance. That mistake would define everything that followed. In public, the church had chosen continuity. In private, parts of the institution had already begun preparing resistance. The same men who had voted beneath Michelangelo's by June of 2026, reform was no longer an idea. It was a threat with documents attached. In the 13 months after his election, Pope Leo XIV moved faster than many inside the Vatican expected. On May 15, 2026, he signed his first encyclical, Magnifica Humanitatis, a sweeping document that confronted the unchecked rise of artificial intelligence and defended the dignity of human labor, human judgment, and human connection. It was not only a theological text, it was an institutional signal that this papacy would speak directly into the machinery shaping the modern world. Then came the 3-year implementation plan for the Synod on synodality. Leo did not treat it as a slogan, a conference theme, or a polite inheritance from Francis. He began turning it into procedures, schedules, reports, and obligations that could be measured. Inside the Vatican, that mattered. A reform becomes dangerous only when it stops being language and starts becoming structure. Beyond Rome, Leo moved across the map with the discipline of a missionary who understood that the church's credibility was being tested far from its monuments. He traveled to Turkey, Lebanon, and Algeria, meeting Muslim leaders and Christian communities in places where Catholic influence had grown faint, but not dead. He spoke about peace, memory, coexistence, and the cost of abandonment. Every trip carried a message. The church would not retreat into its own internal fear while the world burned outside its doors. The pressure intensified when he spoke publicly against the war in Iran. Leo called Donald Trump's threats against Iranian civilization truly unacceptable, and the reaction came almost immediately. Trump answered on Truth Social, calling him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. Inside the Vatican, officials understood that Leo had crossed into a new kind of visibility, where a papal sentence could trigger a political counterattack before the Curia had finished drafting its own internal summaries. But the most dangerous reforms were not the ones the world saw. Inside the Vatican, Leo began changing how the Curia operated. More meetings documented, more financial oversight, fewer decisions allowed to disappear into shadows. Quietly, he began closing the spaces where informal power had survived for years. In January of 2026, he convened the first extraordinary consistory of his pontificate, gathering 170 cardinals for a discussion many called groundbreaking. At the end of that meeting, he told them he felt and experienced the need to be able to count on them. At the time, the sentence sounded like trust. By June, with the manila folder open on his desk and the evidence arranged page after page in front of him, it sounded like a record of betrayal. Leo had asked to count on the College of Cardinals. What the folder showed him was that some of the men entrusted with helping him govern had been counting on his silence instead. The morning of June 26th arrived over Rome with a heat that seemed to settle on the city before sunrise. A haze hung over the Tiber, softening the edges of the bridges and pressing against the stone walls around St. Peter's. By 7, cardinals from every continent were already moving through the basilica corridors, their red vestments crossing the ancient marble in quiet lines. No one outside the Vatican knew that the day had already been altered before it began. The Mass that opened the consistory unfolded with the solemn beauty Rome knows how to produce when history is watching. Venio, Creator Spiritus, rose through St. Peter's Basilica, filling the nave with the old plea for the Creator's Spirit to descend. Pope Leo XIV stood at the altar, composed and steady, his movements precise, his face unreadable beneath the lights. He spoke about the vine and the branches, about Christ as the center, about peace held together through unity. But those closest to him heard something beneath the words. His pauses lasted a fraction longer than usual. His eyes moved differently across the sanctuary, not wandering, not searching, but fixing for brief moments on certain faces before returning to the text. One Monsignor, serving near the altar, later said it felt as if the Pope was speaking to specific men, not only to the congregation. The liturgy remained calm, but the pressure inside it had changed. After Mass, the cardinals left the basilica and moved toward Paul VI Hall. The transition looked ordinary from a distance. Red cassocks, low voices, aides guiding movement through corridors, documents carried under arms. Yet the setup waiting inside the hall had been arranged with deliberate care. 20 round tables stood across the vast space, each one assigned, each one balanced by continent, language, office, and age. 9 tables were reserved for cardinal electors who served as ordinaries. 11 tables were arranged for curial cardinals and non-electors over 80. This was the synodal method Leo preferred. Small groups instead of grand speeches, listening instead of ceremony, encounter instead of hierarchy, performed from a single podium. On paper, the format promised fraternity. In reality, it placed every man close enough to be watched. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the dean of the College of Cardinals, opened the session with the expected words. He spoke about the state of the world, the wars stretching across continents, the pursuit of peace, and the continuing implementation of the Synod. The room listened with the stillness of men trained to reveal little, then reintroduced the Pope for his opening intervention. And the hall shifted before Leo even stood. Leo rose from his chair and walked toward the podium without hurry. He adjusted the microphone slightly downward, placed both hands on the edges of the stand, and looked out across the 20 tables. No paper moved in his hands. No aide approached him. For several seconds, nothing happened except the tightening of attention inside the room, and every cardinal understood that the ordinary script had ended. Leo did not begin with the prepared language of a consistory. He stood behind the podium and allowed the silence to expand across Paul VI's hall until it stopped being respectful and became unbearable. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15. Cardinals who had spent their lives inside ceremonial pauses understood the difference between solemnity and pressure, and this was pressure. At the round tables, small movements began to betray what faces tried to hide. One cardinal lowered his eyes toward the folder in front of him, though nothing on the page had changed. Another adjusted his glasses with unnecessary care. A third clasped his hands so tightly that his knuckles lost color beneath the skin. The Pope still had not spoken, and yet the room already felt as if testimony had begun. Then Leo leaned toward the microphone and said the 3 words that would follow every man out of that hall. "I know everything." He said it quietly, almost gently, without anger, without theater, without the raised voice of a man seeking control. That was what made it worse. He spoke as if he were stating something already proven. No one responded. There was no gasp, no open protest, no dramatic sound that could release the tension. The reaction was smaller and more dangerous. A cardinal reached for his glass of water with a hand that trembled just enough to be noticed. Another crossed his arms across his chest, not in defiance, but like a man protecting himself from impact. Two cardinals at the same table looked at each other for less than a second, and the look carried more fear than any spoken confession. Leo let the sentence remain in the air. He looked again across the 20 tables, not searching for guilt, but allowing guilt to search for itself. The devastation of the moment was not that he named anyone. He did not. The devastation was that every man who had delayed reform proposals, leaked private discussions, redirected funds, or coordinated outside pressure now had to ask the same question in silence. Does he know about me specifically? When the Pope spoke again, his voice stayed controlled. He told them the Church stood at a crossroads unlike any in modern history, and that evangelization could not move forward if the institution worked against its own mission from inside. Unity, he said, was not the absence of disagreement. Unity was the courage to be honest when honesty became painful. Around the hall, men listened as if every sentence had been prepared for someone seated near them. Then Leo made the purpose of the gathering impossible to misunderstand. He said he had not called them there to lecture them, but because he needed them. He reminded them that he had said the same thing in January and had meant it. But then his tone hardened by only a degree, enough for the room to feel the blade beneath the cloth. Some of you have been working against the very mission you swore to serve, and that cannot continue. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop. A cardinal from East Africa leaned forward in his chair, attentive and still. A European cardinal stared at the table as if the polished surface might offer him a place to disappear. An American cardinal blinked rapidly, then looked away before the Pope's eyes reached his side of the room. Leo had not produced the folder, had not read a name, had not displayed a document, and still the old safety of ambiguity had been broken. That was the force of the three words. They did not accuse one man. They unsettled every hidden arrangement in the room. By refusing to name names, Leo made secrecy turn inward against itself, and in that silence, the College of Cardinals understood that the Pope was not opening an investigation. He was revealing that one had already reached them. During the first working session, the official question was simple enough to sound safe. In what kind of world are we called to proclaim the gospel? The cardinals had received the prompt in advance, and the structure followed the usual synodal rhythm. Prayer, silence, small group discussion, shared reflection, written reports. Cardinal Go of Singapore offered a biblical meditation, and for a few minutes the hall appeared to return to procedure. But Leo did not remain in his assigned place. While the groups began speaking among themselves, he stepped away from the front and moved slowly between the tables. He stopped without interrupting, listened without performing attention, and asked brief follow-up questions that sounded ordinary to anyone too far away to hear them. At most tables, the exchanges were warm and collegial. At 3 tables, his presence changed the air. At the Asie de first table, Leo leaned close enough that only 4 or 5 men could hear him. He mentioned a financial transfer made through an intermediary account registered in Luxembourg in February of 2026. He did not describe it vaguely. He cited the exact amount, the channel, and the authorization trail. The cardinal whose name was attached to the approval did not speak. His shoulders stiffened, and the paper in front of him stopped moving under his hand. At the second table, Leo referred to a private letter sent in April to a conservative Catholic media outlet. The letter had carried verbatim lines from a confidential papal meeting, lines that should never have left the walls where they were spoken. Leo described the envelope, the timing, and the path it had taken out of Rome. The cardinal who had sent it stared at the Pope without blinking, then lowered his eyes as if the table had become the only safe place left in the hall. At the third table, Leo named a dinner that had taken place in March at a Roman restaurant. He gave the restaurant's name, the date, the 4 cardinals who attended, and the representative of a traditionalist organization who joined them for dessert. There was no accusation in his tone. There was only precision. The kind of precision that tells a guilty man the witness was closer than he imagined. These were not rumors dressed as warnings. They were facts delivered in whispers. Leo did not strip the men of their dignity in front of the entire college. He did something more unsettling. He left them seated among their brothers with the knowledge that their secrecy had already failed. The effects appeared quietly, one by one. At the first table, the cardinal connected to the Luxembourg transfer excused himself to use the restroom and did not return for 20 minutes. When he came back, his face had lost its color. At the second table, 2 cardinals began whispering urgently until a third man motioned for them to stop. At the third table, the oldest cardinal present, A man in his 80s who had served under 3 popes closed his eyes and clasped his hands as if in prayer. Perhaps it was prayer. Perhaps it was calculation. In Paul, the hall, even silence had become difficult to read. What mattered was that Leo had chosen the method carefully. He had not exposed them from the podium because this was not a performance for applause. It was a warning delivered at close range. By the time the first working session ended, the shape of the consistory had changed. The cardinals were still seated in their assigned groups, still discussing the question printed on the page, still following the structure that had been prepared for them. But beneath the official conversation, another conversation had begun. The Pope knew the transfers, the letters, the dinners, the names, and the dates, and every man in the hall now had to decide whether the next door he opened would be confession or resistance. By the afternoon session, the official subject had changed, but the room had not recovered. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez introduced the theme, drawn from Chapter 5 of Magnifica Humanitatis, the culture of power and the civilization of love. The words belonged to the planned agenda, and the cardinals knew how to discuss them, but the real pressure was no longer in the text. It was in the corridors, in the lowered voices, and in the knowledge that the Pope had already placed facts in front of 3 tables without raising his voice. During the coffee break, small clusters formed outside Paul, the 6-6 hall. Some cardinals spoke quickly, their shoulders angled away from the wider corridor. Some remained apart, watching instead of entering the conversations. Others looked less frightened than relieved because not every man in the hall had been part of the resistance. Many had spent years watching reform stall. Funds move strangely, and confidential conversations surface in hostile outlets without ever being able to prove what they suspected. Then the open dialogue began. With each intervention limited to 3 minutes, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller stood and looked directly toward Pope Leo. His tone was measured, but no one mistook it for soft. He said that the suggestion of organized resistance was a grave accusation, and that grave accusations required evidence, not atmosphere. If the Pope possessed proof of wrongdoing, Müller said, it had to move through proper canonical channels, not through gestures in a plenary session. The hall went still. This was no longer a private whisper at a round table. It was a public challenge to Leo's method, his judgment, and the way he had chosen to confront the College of Cardinals. Every eye moved from Müller to the Pope, the men in Haar. That room understood that the next minute would decide whether the consistory became open rupture or controlled reckoning. Leo listened without interrupting. When Müller finished, the Pope waited 3 full seconds before he answered. He did not defend himself. He did not reach for a document. He only nodded once and said that Müller was right about the need for clarity. Then he made the distinction that changed the room. He said he was not making accusations in the hall. He was offering an invitation. Anyone who needed to come to him, tell the truth, and seek a way forward would find the door open. But anyone who chose silence over honesty had to understand that he would not look away. This church, Leo said, would not hide anymore. A quiet applause moved through the hall. It was not thunderous, and it was not unanimous, but it was real. In that moment, Leo had absorbed the challenge without becoming defensive, and he had turned confrontation into a door no guilty man could pretend not to see. Müller sat down. He did not applaud, but he did not object again. And from a man not known for silence, that silence carried its own weight. What many inside the hall did not see happened immediately after the exchange. When the session broke for a brief pause, Cardinal Raymond Burke approached Cardinal Müller in the corridor outside Paul the 6th hall. Burke had been seated at the same round table as Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe, a deliberate pairing that had already raised quiet attention. He spoke to Müller for less than a minute, his voice low, his body angled toward the hall. Müller listened without moving much. Burke gestured twice toward the room they had just left, then stopped. Müller shook his head once. No one close enough to watch them could hear the words clearly, but the body language was sharp, controlled, intense. Then the 2 men separated without another word, and neither spoke publicly for the rest of the consistory. That evening, the cardinals were invited to dinner with the Pope inside Paul the 6th hall. The formal tension softened on the surface. Wine from the papal cellars was poured, warm bread was passed, and conversations resumed with the careful ease of men who understood that every smile could now be read twice. There was laughter, but it came measured. There were stories, but none of them traveled too far from safe ground. Beneath that surface, the real movement began. Within the same hour, 3 cardinals requested private meetings with Pope Leo. They did not go through the official channels. Each request passed through his personal secretary. Each asked for absolute discretion. Each said the matter was urgent. Later that night, in the private study on the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace, the first cardinal entered. He was from South America, and he told Leo he had been pressured for months to block a reform proposal on financial transparency in diocesan operations. The pressure had not come through official church structures. It came through intermediaries in expensive suits who arrived at his residence in Buenos Aires without appointments and spoke about stability, donor relationships, and the consequences of moving too fast. He named the intermediary. He named the cardinal who authorized the pressure. Then he handed Leo a USB drive containing recorded phone calls made without the other party's knowledge. It violated protocol, but it also proved what words alone could not. The first confession had crossed from fear into evidence. The second cardinal was European. He had discovered that confidential material from the January consistory had been forwarded to a conservative Catholic media outlet within hours of the session ending. Not the full conversations, only selected fragments that could make the Pope appear divided from his cardinals if published without context. He brought printouts, server timestamps, and email routing headers. He had waited 5 months because the office involved was protected by a senior curial figure powerful enough to end a career with one phone call. The third cardinal was African, and what he revealed chilled the room. Representatives of the Society of St. Pius VI had approached him before their planned consecration of 4 bishops without papal consent on July 1st. They wanted him to quietly express support for their position and frame Leo's reforms as a threat to liturgical and doctrinal tradition. He refused, but he knew of at least 2 other cardinals who had not refused. Leo listened to all 3 men without interruption. He took no notes while they spoke. He asked no question until each account had been completed. When each cardinal finished, he gave the same answer with the same controlled calm. "Thank you for your courage. Now, let me show you mine." Only after the 3 cardinals had finished did Leo reveal the part they had not known. The folder was not a surprise to him. He had been expecting it. For 8 months, he had been building a parallel investigation outside the traditional Vatican channels, because he already believed those channels had been compromised. The group reporting to him was small and hand-picked. It included canon lawyers and financial auditors chosen for their integrity, not their alliances inside Rome. They did not answer to curial offices. They did not pass findings through the men whose signatures might appear in the documents. They reported to Leo alone. The folder had confirmed what his team had already assembled. The resistance network was real, and it stood on 3 pillars. The first was financial. Curial officials redirecting discretionary funds toward organizations and media outlets that opposed the Pope's reform agenda. The second was informational, confidential papal communications being leaked to journalists who could be trusted to frame them against him. The third pillar was ecclesiastical. A small group of cardinals had been coordinating with bishops and religious leaders outside Rome to slow or block the implementation of reforms at the local level. Their public language was theological concern. The pattern beneath it was institutional self-preservation and power. Leo had names, dates, documents, and wire transfers. He had the structure, the roots, the offices, and the men who believed distance would protect them. By the end of that night, the 3 cardinals understood that they had not brought the Pope the beginning of the truth. They had brought him confirmation. Nothing about Leo's manner changed as he spoke. He did not sound triumphant. He did not sound wounded. He sounded like a man who had reached the end of patience without losing control of himself. The next morning, the College of Cardinals would learn that the investigation was no longer private. On the second morning, June 27th, Pope Leo XIV changed the agenda. Cardinal Mario Grech was supposed to open with a presentation on synodality, but Leo asked for the floor instead. He stood before the assembled cardinals and spoke for 12 uninterrupted minutes. It was the most personal address of his papacy. He spoke about Peru, about the years in Chulucanas, and about communities surviving on almost nothing while institutional structures consumed resources meant for them. He spoke about the moment he understood that the greatest danger to the church was not always persecution from outside, but decay from within. Then he spoke of Francis, who had trusted the cardinals to carry his vision forward. "Francis trusted you," he said. "I want to trust you too, but trust is not given. It is built, and some of you have been tearing it down." Then Leo made 3 announcements. First, every dicastery of the Roman Curia would undergo an independent financial review within 60 days, conducted by external international auditors personally selected by the Pope. The review would cover 3 years of transactions, all discretionary spending, all donations received and distributed, and every account tied to those offices. Second, a new whistleblower protection office would be created reporting directly to the Pope with authority to protect priests, bishops, cardinals, and lay employees who reported corruption, abuse, or institutional misconduct. Third, Leo addressed the Society of St. Pius VI directly. The group was planning to consecrate 4 bishops without papal consent on July the 1st, just 4 days away. Leo had already sent a personal letter urging their leadership to reconsider, and he said the door to dialogue remained open. But any cardinal or bishop who had privately encouraged, supported, or expressed sympathy with the schismatic action would face real canonical consequences, investigated, documented, and enforced. The consistory continued through its final sessions, but the old culture of silence had cracked. By the evening of June 27th, 7 additional cardinals had requested private audiences with the Pope. Some came to confess involvement in the resistance network. Some came with information they had been afraid to share. 2 came simply to ask for forgiveness. And Leo made clear that forgiveness and accountability were not opposites. In his closing remarks, Leo told the cardinals that what mattered was not the number of meetings, but the honesty those meetings contained. Synodality, he said, was not a series of meetings, but a spiritual style that arose from encounter, grew through listening, and matured through discernment. He said he would reveal the date of the next consistory later in the year. The words sounded hopeful, but every man in the hall heard the warning beneath them. By the end of that evening, the last cardinals filed out of Paul the Hall. The round tables were cleared, the microphones were switched off, and the lights dimmed to a warm amber glow. Pope Leo XIV remained alone for a moment in the empty room. He looked up at the high ceiling, closed his eyes, and felt the burden on his shoulders become lighter. Not gone, only lighter. He had looked into the eyes of 178 men and told them the truth. Some had listened, some had not yet. But the message had been delivered, and it could not be undelivered. Then Robert Francis Prevost straightened his white cassock, turned toward the door, and walked back to the apostolic palace, because the church does not wait, the world does not wait. And a pope who means what he says can never afford to stop.